Hi there. Welcome to Fireside with Peter Adkison on Gen Con TV. Sorry we're a little late today. We had some, the internet went down. That happens. Well, as you know, on this show, we go in search of the untold stories behind your favorite games. And this episode, we are continuing our deep dive into Dungeons and Dragons. And that is with our guests today, Mary Kirchoff and James Lowder. Now, Mary and James have a shared history and involvement in Dungeons and Dragons fiction, novels, and Mary as an editor, James as an author. And so we thought it'd be interesting to have them both on, both here at the same time. James has notable novels under his belts like Prince of Lies, Knight of the Black Rose. Mary went on from TSR Wizards of the Coast to become VP at Wizards of the Coast, marketing, publishing, and tabletop games. And James went on to write fiction and RPGs for numerous game companies and eventually moved into editing and directing other writers, currently as executive editor for Chaosium. Yeah, so Mary and James, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yay! Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm kind of going to talk to Mary and James separately a little bit to catch them, to figure out their lives, who they are, up to the point where their lives collided, and then it's just going to be a free-for-all at that point. So, Mary, since you ended up at TSR earlier than James, we're going to start with you. So, give us kind of a who was Mary before TSR, and how did you get into TSR?
Well, I wish I could say that I chose TSR as a passion, but writing and publishing was a passion of mine. And I actually grew up in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, one of the few, I think.
The home of TSR, the original.
Home of the original TSR.
Right.
And ENnie Gygax was a classmate of mine. So that was all happening when I was in high school. There was that group of people creating that crazy game. And then I went off to college. Was going to come out and go into publishing, and came out, traveled a little bit.
Where did you go to college, by the way? Where was that?
I went to Lawrence University in Wisconsin, in Appleton, Wisconsin.
Oh, okay.
And came out intent on a publishing future of some sort, but was broke, as most college graduates, or many college graduates are, and needed a job locally. Or I had to, go out on a limb and be one of the poor line editors or copy editors in New York. And my mother had a client, Rose Estes, who introduced me to some opportunities, some job openings at TSR at that time.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you there for a question. Yeah. So before this point, I mean, did you know what TSR was? Did you know about Dungeons and Dragons? Did you play these geeky games like we did?
Well, I have to confess, I did not, actually. That group was in a different part of the high school hallway than my group was. But when I came back, I loved that the company had expanded beyond just that game. And they had just started their novel department. I think Rose Estes had written a handful of the Pick a Path books at that point. Yep. So I was not a game player, but I was a fiction reader and a fantasy fiction reader. And so the opportunity scratched some of the itch that I had. The job opportunities that were available at that time, I applied for a job in Gen Con, did not get it. I applied.
By the way, there's always an extra gold star anytime you mention Gen Con. I just want to make sure you both know that. That's fair good. Enough. Good.
Well, I did not pass the Gen Con audition, so I'm not sure if you have to take my gold star away or not.
It's a high standard, Mary.
I'm not sure it was quite as high then, but it was the right choice. Jim will say that later, but it's the right choice. I also interviewed with Harold Johnson for a position as a game editor. Absolutely.
Harold Johnson being one of the legends of the TSR from way back in the day. He was on our show a few weeks ago. Great guy.
Sure, great guy. He passed on me too, which was a good idea. It was
Wait,
not
why was that a good idea? I'm sorry.
Because my passion,
past that.
my passion was not the games. My knowledge was not the games.
So it was a game job that he offered you.
It was a game job.
Yeah. Come in to write monster stats or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And interestingly enough, the job I did end up getting gave me that exposure and that opportunity, but it wasn't all about that.
Right.
I ended up, my third time was the charm. Frank Menser hired me to, he had just started the RPGA at that time. And I think he had put together a couple editions of the Polyhedron.
And I interrupt whenever we drop names sometimes, just like a lot of people that watch this maybe have no idea, but the RPGA was the Role Playing Gamers Association that TSR started back in the 80s, I guess. And
early
what
80s.
was amazing about it is it tried to be supportive of all all role-playing games, not just TSR. I mean, certainly TSR got the lion's share of the attention, but there was always this nod towards supporting organized play of role-playing games. So anyway, sorry, go on.
Absolutely, all true. So I ended up being the editor of the Polyhedron Newsine. That was my job when I first came in. So I had to figure out games. I had to figure out how to work in a company because I was fresh out of college. And my English degree didn't really come with any editing skills, I have to say. Jim's laughing too, because unless you go to J school, nobody's teaching you the Chicago Manual of Style. Yep. So I have very vivid memories of cramming the Chicago Manual of Style so that I could pass some tests. And
I've got one here somewhere. Yeah. Okay, so I got to ask you. You said learning how to work in a company and learning about games. Now, which of those two challenges was harder?
I would have to say the game piece, to be honest with you, because I felt like I had arrived in a spaceship in the first week when one of my first experiences was to go to, I think it was called Spring Fling or some spring convention that the company participated in at the American Legion Hall. It was like my first week there. It was in early March, 1982. And I just got pushed into this room full of very gamer people who weren't necessarily my people yet. And it was, I felt like a stranger in a strange land, but only for a little while. Yeah. Yeah.
So you worked on Polyhedron. Okay, so like kind of fill us in a little bit more of how your time at TSR evolved up to the time when James joins the story here.
I will fast forward a little bit here.
Well, I will keep interrupting you.
Fair enough. So the common theme in the first phase of the Mary Kirchoff TSR experience, the common theme is news, is magazines. So time seemed both long and really short back then.
And just in case anybody out there doesn't know what a magazine is, this is something we had back in the day, which is kind of like a book, but bigger, a little thinner, lots of pictures.
Subscribe or go to a bookstore to buy. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So there was a whole magazine group at TSR at that time, headed by Kim Mohan. And Polyhedron was absorbed into that group. And that group existed of Dragon Magazine, Aries. I think we had just gotten one other, we had just done the SPI acquisition, and some magazines came with that. So Roger Moore and I ended up doing Aries together. Mm-hmm. I ended up kind of being an assistant on Dragon Magazine, and then I continued to do Polyhedron. Fast forward a year or so, and I decided to leave and go write novels, because if you remember, that was my original goal, right? Was to write novels. So I left to go write novels.
Okay. One quick question about the magazines. I know we're trying to get up to where James can join in, but when you said you did magazine, you did Polyhedron, did D&D or Dragon Magazine, were you like soliciting articles and editing them and?
Yes, that's a great question. Magazine publishing at that time still included Waxer. not the kind of waxer you might think. That was when we actually waxed paper and put key lines down on boards, and those were photographed. And TSR had a whole photo, a whole dark room where all of this was done. So when you did magazines, you acquired. When Roger and I were doing Aries magazine, we were interfacing with people from space agencies to get photos. It's from A to Z.
Wow.
From acquisition to actually setting type sometimes. If you weren't as rigid in your deadlines as you needed to be, and ultimately had to set your own type.
All right. Okay. So let's go to phase 2 then now. So you left.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Phase 1.
Yeah.
So phase 2, I left, wrote some Pick a Path books.
Cool.
Really enjoyed that. Got married to another well-known TSR guy, Steve Winter. And
great guy. He was on our show. I had him as a guest a few weeks ago.
I saw him. Very interesting guy, Steve. Always a good storyteller. And so he was telling me stories. We were having our first child, and TSR called me back and said, actually the book department called me back and said, we need a book editor. We're going to be expanding our book department. We've just done the Dragonlance books. We want to go wild with and expand the book line into other worlds, and we'd like you to be a part of that. Okay. And so that's where my book history started in 1987. And the probably the biggest note during that time is I remember I was handed what we called the slush pile, which was manuscripts that people submitted that we hadn't asked for and that might have nothing to do with our worlds. And my mandate when I first came in was to find the next Weiss and Hickman, to be honest with you. I pulled a book out of the pile that was called Echoes of the Fourth Magic that I didn't really like, to be honest with you, but I liked the writing style. Right. And Bob tells this story better than I do, but I had about 2 to 3 minutes or 2 to 3 months before the book had to go to typesetting. Really short deadline by anybody's standards. And so I phoned Bob Salvatore up and said, I don't want to buy that book, but I want you to write a book in the Forgotten Realms. And he thought I was asking him to write a sequel to Doug Niles' Darkwalker on Moonshade. And he submitted a sequel to Darkwalker on Moonshade, just submitted an outline for it. And I said, no, we've just eaten up a week of your 2.5 months. Doug's going to write his own sequel, start again. Put a pin on a map, find a map of the Forgotten Realms, figure out what you want to develop, and bring me another story. Right. And that became his first book for us. Yes.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that's the origin story there.
All right. Is this a good place to switch to James?
I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that need to develop those book lines required more people. And so.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So we've laid the foundation here. We've got one career on a trajectory, and now we got to get the other career on the trajectory so we can have that collision. So James, welcome to the show. Do you know the drill now? You saw how I treated Mary. You're going to get the same treatment. Yeah.
So there's a lot of similarities and some differences from Mary's story. I grew up in Massachusetts in the small town of Whitman, birthplace of the Toll House Cookie.
Compared to the birth of Dungeons and Dragons, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Whitman had the Toll House Cookie, the country's first tack factory. And I started playing D&D in the late 70s, 77, 78, so fairly early first generation player. And I played throughout high school, played a lot of D&D, some Gamma World, Call of Cthulhu, Villains and Vigilantes, Pendragon. Those were the kind of the 5 big ones we played a lot of. One of the long-running D&D campaigns I had took place in a house behind a kiddie amusement park in Whitman, King's Castle Land, which had giant fiberglass dragons that really breathed fire, and so we played D&D back behind the castle.
Wow.
They had a toy store too, which was one of the only ones in the area in the late 70s in Whitman where you could buy the D&D stuff, and they carried it because the owner's kid was also playing.
So I got to interrupt. It's so funny because our stories are so similar in some ways, except for the Toll House Cookie Pit. But I started gaming at the same time, and even the Whitman references are working because there was in Walla Walla there's a school called Whitman.
So there you go. Okay.
Yeah.
So I left Massachusetts in '81 and went to do my undergrad at Marquette in Milwaukee. Which I chose because they had a good liberal arts program. I'd never been further west than New York City once. Got on a plane, came out to Milwaukee, loved Marquette, and worked on the literary magazine there for a couple of years. As Mary notes, when you work when you've got an English degree, you don't know any of the actual publishing stuff unless you interact with the journalism school people. And so I worked on the literary magazine for a couple of years as an editor, did some writing for them as well, and continued to play. One of the people that I met early on at Marquette was Debbie Davidson, who became my wife shortly after we graduated. But she had been playing since the 70s as well. It was something we had in common initially. At Marquette, I also met John Ratliff, who would later be working for TSR. John and I had a science fiction class together, which I still think the teacher probably has flashbacks to, because if you know John Ratliff, it was either John or I raising some objection to every point that came up in that class. And John was at Marquette working on the Tolkien manuscripts.
Right.
And I didn't even know they were there. John, after class one day, said, "Well, I'm going over to work on the Tolkien manuscripts. Do you want to see them?" What?
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
So I graduated Marquette with a double major in English and history and a minor in philosophy, kind of the liberal arts trifecta there, and went on to graduate school at the University of Illinois, where my goal was to get my PhD eventually in medieval lit and teach that and write on the side. I was going to write, but my reasonable plan was that I would get my PhD.
Right.
I enjoyed teaching at Illinois. I taught writing and film and fantasy lit. Loved teaching all of the classes. It was amazing. I hated academia.
Huh.
So
now, what about academia? Was it
it was the focus on the wrong things. I got chewed out at one point for not spending enough time working on papers to get published and spending too much time on the freshman composition classes I taught.
Right.
And I thought I would be getting my PhD to teach, not to publish articles and doing the committee stuff and that was the part that didn't work. I love the literature, I love the teaching. The other parts of it didn't work for me.
Right.
So
that chewing out from your boss did continue later, though, I would say.
And it does to this day.
Yes, I bet it does.
It does. I left Illinois and came back up to Milwaukee and thought, all right, well, now I've got to get a job. And so I started applying to places, and like Mary, I applied to TSR twice before I got the third time was I actually got the job. The first time I applied was for Gen Con, which again, I made.
Ding, gold star.
What's with that snotty department? Right?
So I actually made it down to the last interviews. It was me or Mark Olson to run Gen Con. And
Mark was a good hire.
And they hired Mark, and he was definitely the right person to hire. I would never have lasted a year doing that job. No way. And then I interviewed with Gene Black, who had been running the department when Mary came back. And Gene again, I made it to the last interview, and Gene hired Eric Severson instead of me, who had an agricultural journalism major, which was baffling to me at the time. But Eric actually turned out to be exactly the right hire for that point too, because what the department needed were editors in fiction who were not game experts. So, and this ties in with Mary. Eric took over as Bob Salvatore's editor after Mary edited the first couple, and I think Bob's success owes a lot to Eric.
I do too.
Eric helped Bob write to a more general audience because Eric was not a gamer. And so he helped, and Bob knew the games and Bob knew fantasy, and Eric helped him write to a more general audience. And I think the success Bob had eventually really comes from the work Eric did. So like, again, in retrospect, brilliant hire. Eric was a great hire for the department at the time.
Yeah, great guy.
After that,
great guy too. Went on to become a Unitarian minister.
Yep.
Which brought its own flavor to the team too.
Yep, who left TSR, who went into the clergy in one way or another, is a substantial story in itself. I think that kind of says something, but
yeah, he was the moral center of the team. Yeah.
So
we had the bad boy, you know.
Yeah, Gene kept my resume around and actually offered me a freelance job to edit a Time Life series of books the company TSR was going to do to do the 50th anniversary of World War II, that were going to be histories of World War II with war games in the back. And Gene tried to sell those to management for about a year. And Doug and they were, yes, we'll bring you back. We want you to freelance these because you can do both. You've got the history degree and you're a gamer. Perfect. This is just what we need you to do. And Gene never did get them to accept those books. In the meantime, I interviewed with Gary Gygax over at New Infinities, and with Frank Menser and Kim Mohan, who had all left TSR by that point to go to NIFI.
Peter, you might want to explain to people who Gary Gygax is. I know you like to jump in and do that.
The name may be familiar.
Yeah, that one we got covered. Yeah. We got that one. We mentioned him before.
He's probably come up.
Yeah, he's come up.
So Gary offered me a job as kind of a generalist fiction game person at NIFI, because they had both a fiction department that Kim Mohan was running and Frank was running the games, and I was going to do stuff for both because of my background.
But now I do have a question related to that. You said Gary Gygax and New Infinities.
Yes.
What was that? I don't catch that reference.
So New Infinities was the company that Gary started after he left TSR.
Okay, but the way you were talking, okay, now I know.
They were over in Burlington, and they did Cyborg Commando and some of the other stuff there.
Yeah.
They had a good fiction line too. They published Gary's stuff, but also some other general fantasy fiction. So I was then waiting for the job at New Infinities to start, but the company was in trouble, and they ended up delaying.
Yeah.
And while I was waiting, I got a phone call from Mary saying, well, so things have changed in the department a little bit, and we're looking for somebody to come in with more game knowledge for the fiction stuff. And your resume was at the top of Gene's pile. And so Mary hired me, which then meant I got to send Gary a note saying, sorry, I'm going to work for TSR, which was deeply uncomfortable. But actually Gary and Don Turnbull, both, Don used to be TSR UK and was kind of the COO of New Infinities. Don sent me this really charming note back saying, well, we've all been through that.
So I need to ask a question because I don't know the answer to this, or at least I don't remember the answer to this. Why did you take the TSR job instead of the Gary Gygax job?
Well, they were still delaying. And when you called and I came in and talked to you, and what you wanted me to do was exactly the job that I wanted.
Good answer.
Oh, okay, so hey, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I was thinking maybe we do a little role playing. We could reenact role play that interview, like.
Oh my God.
Jim can probably remember it better than I can. I do have one memory of it after, though, that Jim may one painful memory afterward.
Oh no.
Yeah, I was just joking about the interview role play anyway. So yeah, Mary, what's your painful memory?
Well, the painful one was I hired Jim. I had no question that this is a guy who's going to help fill out our deck here. I'm not the big gamer. My perspective is different. Eric's got us anchored. We also had another lovely gentleman who had cut his teeth, and Bill Larson, who was already in the department, in the book department. And had cut his teeth on books that were dear to my heart when I was growing up. The Trixie Belden series. He had been at Golden Books in Racine, Wisconsin.
He had worked.
Not a gamer. So we had the guys with editing skills, but not gamers part of the department covered. And so I had no doubts that Jim was a great addition. And at that time, I did not make any kind of typing test. You know where I'm going with this, Jim.
Now I do.
I assumed anybody who wanted to write novels knew how to type. And my boss at the time, because I had been asked to take over Gene Black's position, that's how I came to be the one to hire Jim. When I came back, when they invited me back, Gene stepped away for personal reasons, and I inherited the book department as the manager and Gene's pile of resumes with Jim on the top. And I don't know, must have been a week or so after Jim started, my boss, Jim Ward, one of my very dear friends, a colorful, controversial TSR character of longstanding, pulled me to the side and said, I just saw Jim Lowder typing, and he types with 2 fingers. What the heck did you hire him for?
Yep.
I said, go ahead, Jim.
So in the interview, Mary had asked me, can you type whatever it was, 40 or 60 words a minute? And I said yes, because the question wasn't, do you use both hands and all 5, fingers on both hands? But I had actually gone through, when I was at Marquette, I worked in the English department as a research assistant. And I had to take a typing test to get that job. So I actually could honestly say, yes, I can type. It's these 2. Left hand is for shift. And I still type that way.
So the things you remember. It's like,
Jim was mad.
He was
mad.
He probably is still mad about it.
He
but I have to say, Jim and I looked for different things in people, which is what ultimately led me to throw a stapler at his head one time as my supervisor. Left a dent in the drywall, I'll say. Still have the stapler. I was trying to dent Jim's head, only hit the drywall. It just points out that everybody's looking for something else. Jim turned out to be the absolute perfect hire. I'm going to say before, I know we got more time, but I want to make sure I get this in. I get a lot of credit for finding Bob Salvatore, and I get a lot of credit for the second or maybe the third version of the TSR book program. And then there's the WotC phase, which is probably, phase 7 or something, if you're actually counting. I get a lot of credit for it, but there was a lot of people who participated in, and none more importantly than Jim, who is the unsung hero of all that we created at that time. That gamer perspective, but also a sensibility about what non-gamers want to read, really helped us create a book program that honored authors, when I feel like before we arrived, authors were not necessarily honored for their contribution. Even in the early days, Margaret and Tracy.
Yep.
At that time, TSR really saw the brand as king, and Jim and I both viewed it differently. We felt like and witnessed that what each author brings to whatever world they're working in creates its own following. Clearly, Bob Salvatore did, and many other authors did. And a number of us wrote in worlds that Margaret and Tracy created and did not achieve the same level of success Margaret and Tracy did. So clearly, the individual author was important, and their contribution was important. And Jim and I both agreed on that. And the foundation of the program, the book program we created, which I would call the third iteration of TSR's book program. There was the early Pick a Path books. Then there was the early Dragonlance books, which led to
Yep.
the first Darkwalker on Moonshade book, Doug's first book. And then there was our phase for TSR books, which was when I think the majority of the worlds were developed, that we worked with a game team to develop the fiction piece of.
Yep.
But it was important to both of us that the author's voice be present in every one of those books, whether they owned the rights to the work or not.
Yeah, and that was huge. I mean, one of the first things Mary and I ended up lobbying for with management was to get the authors' names put on the spines of the books.
Mm.
That was a huge fight. It took us like a year to get them to agree to put author names on the spines, because the company as a whole wanted all the Forgotten Realms books shelved together. And we were saying, well, they're going to be shelved together anyway, because that's how they shelve book groups like that. You know, Star Trek is all largely shelved together. But we were trying to actually shift it so that the authors are getting more recognition. And then over from 88 to about 90, we changed the way the department fundamentally handled authorial voice, and fundamentally handled things like schedules and deadlines. We shifted it so authors were seeing page proofs more than rather having the editor rewrite something and then it goes to the printer and the author gets it and then they see what happened to it. We changed it completely because we very consciously went into it as these people are bringing things to the world. They should be treated more respectfully for what they're generating. And that was a lot, and it was a tough fight. We raised the royalty rates, and that was and all of those took years to accomplish. Years.
Hey, so we have a question from chat. The question is, I've always been curious about the interplay between the fiction and game departments for classic settings like Dark Sun, well, let's say Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance and so on. The former did have some prominent fiction, but seemed to diverge from the game pretty significantly. Oh, I think he is specifically talking about Dark Sun, maybe. But the fundamental question of the interplay between, like, who's driving the brand? Is it the
Good question.
That's a really good question. I actually spent some time this morning thinking about that and how we interacted. I'll start out, Jim, and then you give your perspective, because you were kind of that bridge between books and games. I sent you in to talk to the other side. The truth is, we spent a lot of our time trying to, and when I think about my career, there's kind of a common theme here too. Books was seen when we started to be the tail of the dog, if we were on the dog at all.
Yep.
Games drove everything. And that really started to change with Dragonlance. Totally have to give credit to Margaret and Tracy and Jean for shifting from pick-a-path books to fiction. But that's when things started to change. I will say that it was a struggle with the game department to be seen as an equal. And a lot of what bonded the book publishing team together was that fight for recognition that that novels and novel authors added value to the world. We weren't just telling the stories that the games Bob alone created whole parts of the Forgotten Realms that didn't exist before. Right. So that was a fight that we fought, and it bonded us together. We fought it for the authors, but we fought it for, just because it was the right thing to do, that it was a symbiotic relationship and one didn't exist without the other. If the game team hadn't created those worlds, we wouldn't have been writing novels. That's certainly true. But there's no better format for telling a story, a continuous story with a beginning, middle, and end, than a novel. And so a lot of our time together was negotiating at least an acknowledgement that novels were not subservient to game product. And it required a fair amount of negotiation and Madeleine Albright, top level diplomacy. But I mostly sent Jim in to do with the game team so that they respected our perspective on that. At the same time, it was also our intent. We knew we were working in a world that was created by teams of other people. And it was really our intention to not change those rules, to honor those rules, to be to have fidelity to not just the intention, but the spirit, but the rules themselves. Yeah. And that turned out to be a hard thing to do when some of us weren't gamers, required reading way more manuals when you were editing a novel than some of us signed up for. But we tried. We tried.
So I want to ask you, James, that the same question for you. Get your opinion on this, but I want to add to it, which is if you can remember a moment, like if you can remember a discussion or a debate with somebody in the games, like I don't know if you have an example of this, since you were the guy being sent.
Oh God, well, so early on, I mean, the baptism of fire for all of this was Avatar, which was conceived as a novel trilogy that was going to explain the transition from first edition Forgotten Realms to second edition, with the books being written at the same time that Zeb Cook was finishing up the second edition rules. Okay. And there was a product, Hall of Heroes, that was going to include some game material that was derived from the fiction. And I asked the Karen Baumgarten at the time, well, has anybody shown this to the authors? And the answer was no. Why not? You guys can just ask the authors. You could ask Bob Salvatore if this write-up for his character is accurate. Everybody will be happier that way. Bob will be happy, you'll be happy, the product will come out and it will be, accurate. Right. And that was something that really there had been no discussions going on. And then part of it was a status thing, because there's that, in the hierarchy of pop culture, novels are here and games are here. They're down a little bit. So if you're a novelist and you got your name on the novel, that's more status. So there was all of that playing out in the company as well. And, Margaret and Tracy had gotten very successful, and they had left, and they were very successful in New York at this point. So part of the negotiations were trying to find ways, as Mary said, to make it clear that we would develop the fiction in ways that were respectful of the game material and reflected it. But also part of it was, reminding the game people that not everybody can write a novel. Not everybody can write a short story. So, just as much as we respect the game department and everything you do, you have to respect that there are people coming in and adding things to this IP through a novel series or short stories or whatever it was, that may not necessarily be your skill set. And we all win when that's integrated. So after Avatar, which was it was both a wild success and a flaming disaster simultaneously. Jeff Grubb had at one point drawn a little whirlpool with a stick figure, Jim Lowder, being sucked into it, and that said, Avatar Vortex, abandon hope, all ye who enter here, and stuck it on the door of my office, because products kept getting added to Avatar. Oh, we'll have it interact with the DC comic books, and we'll have it interact with these miniatures, and we'll have it, and none of that was planned. And this was all at a time when all of this stuff was being done out of house with no internet. Right. So we get FedEx packages from Ed and 3 different authors writing the novels that were connected intimately. Novel 2 picks up the day novel 1 ends, being written by 3 authors in 3 different time zones who had never met.
What year are we in now?
89.
Okay.
88, 89.
Time, since I remember finding Jim at the office at like midnight editing books to make deadlines. You have to realize this is dog years, yep. Those 2 or 3 years that we were developing this were really way longer than they seemed.
This idea I'm very familiar with.
Yes, yeah. I bet you are. So I want to dog ear 2 things here, because I want to make sure we cover them. One, and I got to remember what they are now. This dynamic is ultimately what inspired what we believed was a new paradigm with Dark Sun.
Yes.
And Dark Sun was created with a representative of the book team, a representative from games. It was from the ground up as a result of this drama that was Avatar and other series to lesser degrees, with Jim primarily being the conduit between games and books, saying, we're trying to follow your lead, but this doesn't necessarily, we're going to add this one thing to a book because what's in the game doesn't necessarily translate very well into a book medium. It led to trying to create the next new world with representatives of all groups on the team to start out with. And I would say on the whole, it worked pretty well.
It was brilliant, yeah.
Yeah, it actually worked better than I would have expected, particularly since I was the book representative on it and I'm not a gamer. But there was enough gamers on that team to cover the game aspect.
And then when you handed, and I was the one that edited the first 5 novels because you developed the world with the fiction in mind, and then I got to implement working with the game stuff to make the novels work with the games. So yeah,
you can't think of Dark Sun without thinking of Brom too.
Right.
I mean,
exactly
was he on
right.
the team? Was the artist?
He was. Yeah, he was.
Wow.
It was Tim
good.
Brown,
Troy
Denning, and Brom. It was the 4 of us. Yeah.
Right.
And we didn't always agree.
And then Steve Winter and I were the secondaries. We came in after the initial team did all the groundwork, because Steve was going to run the editorial in the game department, and I was going to run the editorial in the fiction. And it was all done very deliberate and creator friendly in ways that and that's why you look at those Dark Sun products and they reflect Brom's vision, and they reflect Troy's vision and Mary's vision for what the fiction should have been, and Tim Brown's vision for what the games should have been. And it was a complete collaborative process. It was great.
It acknowledged all the pieces, and is actually, as you pointed out, Jim, one of the first times that an artist was brought in to create the look right up front, instead of being handed a manuscript and told, come up with something that looks like it should be with this.
Right.
So it wasn't just bringing in book people, it was also bringing in the artistic vision right from the beginning. The other point I want to make sure we talk about that has to do with not all is something I'm going to go back to something you said, Jim, which is that not everybody can write a novel. A lot of people want to write a novel, but not everybody can, and it's way harder than you think. But there was a perception in the early days, and it's something that Jim and I addressed. It was kind of an HR thing, but also how do we find more writers? We got the tiger by the tail. We need a lot of books. There's a lot of stories to tell in the Forgotten Realms alone, because it's a big damn world. There's a lot of ground to cover and a lot of stories to be told here. How do we find enough authors, and how do we find them fairly? And how do we find them outside of this cocoon that is TSR? How do we, even in this cocoon, how do we assign books fairly, instead of it seeming like we're assigning books to friends? And so Jim was very, still a very author-friendly and focused editor in his work. Together with some other people, we conceived the idea of what we called an audition. I'm not sure that people listening to this or at that time might actually still believe that we made it as fair as we could, but we created a system of opportunity internally and externally for people to submit their ideas for a novel, so that TSR was protected against any perception of nepotism or favoritism or just hanging them all to game people, which then caused problems with getting game products done on time. You can imagine the HR nightmare of that. But we also wanted to, go find more Bob Salvatores. We wanted to, who else is out there that could write in our world if we give them just a couple of beat points to work with. And so take it from there, Jim.
And so the two things, one is that, the way we did the slush pile. My job at TSR started off, I was an editorial assistant, I think, for like 2 weeks. Technically,
probably. Remember dog years, though. That was
exactly
like
right. In book department years, it was like 8 years, but it was really like 2 weeks. Because we were a small department, we were all doing everything. Here, write this back cover copy. Here, write this standee that's going to show up in B. Dalton next week, because it needs to be done. Whatever needs to be done.
And go to the sales conference to sell all those books.
Exactly. Yeah, I did a Random House sales conference when Mary was pregnant with her second kid, and we all learned a lot. And that was part of the thing that Eric, being an ag journalism guy, brought things to the department with his perspective that helped. Bill Larson, because he had worked at Western Publishing on Trixie Belden and other series books had
Nancy
input.
Drew.
Even Pat McGilligan, who was one of the freelance guys, had done a bunch of books with New York, and he was giving us input on stuff too. And Sue Wineland and the other people who got brought in, everybody the department was actually much more diverse in terms of background.
Jane
And that
Cooper.
ended up being reflected in how we put the audition stuff together. But one of my other jobs early on was Slush, which is the unsolicited manuscripts. And through the audition process in Slush, the people I brought in were Elaine Cunningham and Christy Golden and Mary Herbert and a lot of the other people who have gone on and written a bunch of other stuff for different companies and were very important for TSR at the time. They came in because Mary and I especially set up that process to open a doorway for people to come in. And in terms of whether or not our process was fair, I can always point to this fact. The first 2 novels I wrote for TSR, I had to audition blind for too. So and that was something I was strongly in favor of. If I can't go through the audition process like everyone else, and what we did was we took names got taken off of the submissions, and only the editorial assistant, which was somebody else by the time I was auditioning, that person was the only one who knew what submission attached to what names. They were just numbered. And 3 different people in the department would read them, and we would all give them grades on 4 or 5 different writing style, knowledge of the world, things like that. And we'd tally them all up, and we'd all get into a room and spend an afternoon going over all the submissions. And if you were submitting for something, you were out of that process. And it was great. And I think it went a long way toward improving the process and improving the quality of the books. And the other thing that we did with that, and this goes back to what Mary was saying about the way in which fiction interacted with the game material. We encouraged people to find characters that created their own characters and find corners of the realms that weren't being dealt with elsewhere.
Right.
So tell a story that is focused in Bob with, his part of Icewind Dale, Doug doing the Moonshades off, and that's kind of Doug's, part of the world.
We didn't let anybody else go there, despite Bob's efforts to go there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Divide it up into sort of territories. See, we got about 15 minutes late. I'm wondering if there's another topic that we can cover in sort of a 5+ minutes, or another story from like what happened between then and say the WotC acquisition, because you left, James, shortly before the WotC acquisition.
I left twice. I quit TSR twice. I resigned in late 91, early 92, and Mary set up a satellite deal for me. The best part about the job was in the book department was that everybody loved what they were doing and everybody was incredibly passionate about it, but it was a grueling process. And it was, I slept in my office rather than drive up to my apartment in Greenfield, 45 minutes away. The dictionaries we had made a really nice pillow. And
it's an unrelenting, publishing is unrelenting deadlines.
It is. And it had gotten to the point where actually I had to go to the dentist because I was grinding my teeth so badly. I flattened out my eye teeth and broke a crown.
I'm so proud. See what I did as a manager. Get back to work. Well, part of that was Mary went off on maternity leave with her second kid, and Mike Martin, one of the VPs at TSR, put me in charge of the book department and told me I couldn't let anyone know. That's right up there on the why would you ever do that? So I got to stick my head into Bill Larson's office, who'd been editing, longer than I'd been alive, and say, so how's that book going, Bill? And Bill and Eric finally, what the hell are you pestering us about this for? And I had to tell them, look, I'm having to report. I've got all the responsibility and no power to keep things on the rails here. And
so anyway, I resigned in late '91. Mary set up a really good satellite program where I could continue working on the books, continue working for the company, do some more writing myself without the day-to-day stress. Because yeah, I'm much better now, but I'm sure both of you have never heard of me being at all confrontational or combative or disruptive. It is all a lie, and certainly was not anything like where I was in '88 and '90.
It was a tough time.
Oh,
it was a tough time.
And then when Mary left, they brought somebody else in from New York, who was the devil, and so I left after that in '94.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about.
Yes, I'm sure you do.
I think I fired him.
Well, but you did.
Yes,
and
you did.
I mean, part of it was, and this was, he was put in a position where he was antithetical to everything Mary and I had done for, the high point in '89 to '91, where the department was, in its golden age, where authors were being respected, and the process made it clear that everybody was getting books because they could pitch the books and make them work. And he came in and undid all of that. And it was just a really bad fit for what the company should have been. And it was antithetical to what I wanted to do in publishing, so I left.
So I, with my experience with authors and novels is a little bit more indirect, because by the time Wizards got into publishing novels, we were big enough that I had layers of management between me and that. And but art was a different thing. I've commissioned a lot of art. I've worked with a lot of artists. I don't consider myself a good art director, but I can at least manage someone through the process. And but a lot of how you're describing the values of that you were a proponent of, the values that we're driving for what you wanted in the publishing department. It seems there's a lot of similarities, it seems, between that and how you treat artists, and in terms of credits and respect and involvement in the creative process and all this stuff.
Yeah, the credits and things like that, and giving people, creating a system in which you set parameters for people to do their work, and you let them do their job and be creative within those parameters. So you stop them from blowing up the moon in the Forgotten Realms every book, but you give them as much leeway as possible and give them credit then for what they do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that went away during that brief period. And when you showed up in my backyard again, Peter, after a couple of year hiatus, and said, I want you to come back, people came back because they recognized that value was back. And that's
why I came back and wrote Spectre of the Black Rose for you, Peter, because that was what, when you were running Wizards and you brought those things back, it was very clear that you mirrored those values as well.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very, very generous of you to say. So, well, we just have a few minutes. I know time just goes by fast. I want to give each of you a chance to, pimp what you're doing now. Like, what if there's anything you'd like to promote that you're involved with now, or what your life's been. Summarize the next 20 years in 2 minutes. That sort of thing. However you want to do it.
Well, Jim's still in the industry, so I'm going to give him the bulk of the time. My life and my career always takes big left turns, so I'll come last if you're ready, Jim.
Oh, sure. So after I stopped working with TSR in '94, really from '92 on, I was a freelancer. I was a hired gun, and didn't work for one company primarily until 2016. And during that time, I put together about 20 to 25 anthologies for different places, and wrote a lot of material myself, short stories, creator own stuff. I worked in comics. I edited 75 issues of Hack Slash and did some other comics for Image and Devil's Due. And so I've been really fortunate. And part of the reason that I was successful at all of that was because of the skills that I put together at TSR. There wasn't any point in the book production process where, as Mary had said, you were late. You had to go up and make your own typesetting corrections on the typesetting machine, because that had to be done. And so I learned an incredible amount of skills that I've managed to put in my freelance. In 2015, 2016, the Chaosium guys took over the company. Greg Stafford shifted ownership of Chaosium to the new company, and they initially brought me on as a consultant to, they had heard about my creator-friendly reputation in the industry, and I was there to help them settle the debt that they had from the old company not paying authors in the fiction department. They owed people a lot of money, and it burned a lot of people. And so I spent a year putting on my asbestos underwear and opening my email and having people scream about stuff. And then the partners had backed this up from the start and said, and we're going to fix all of this. And I knew it was a good fit. The first interview I had with them at Gen Con, Jeff Richard, who's the creative director, and I were talking, and I said, okay, well, I'm just going to say this right up front. And this is, again, it's uncharacteristically blunt of me. If I find out that you guys are screwing people over, I will be outside with the mob with the torches and pitchforks in 30 seconds. And Jeff said, yeah, of course. I'm in.
That's great.
So since doing that consulting work for them, it turned out to be a really good fit. And I've helped them with a bunch of other stuff, and they named me executive editor. And I've been helping them do a lot of problem solving stuff and doing a lot of the jobs, Mary, that I was doing for you, which actually turns out to be my strong suit. How do I get to be the reasonable guy in the room? That tells you how nuts the conversation is.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Well, the advantage that I've got is I can see, like I did at TSR, I could see the fiction side of it and the gaming side of it. Right. And I could find workable solutions. So I've been working with Chaosium almost exclusively now. I've still got a couple other freelance things, but I love it. I love working.
That's
a great company.
Yeah, it's a classic. It's such an important company in terms of the history in our industry, and also a company that has straddled this line between fiction and games, like TSR, strong similarity. So I have a closing question for you, James. I get overwhelmed sometimes just thinking back. All the working at Wizards of the Coast, and in the 90s, and working on Magic the Gathering, then Dungeons and Dragons, the two greatest games in the history of the world. When you think back to your time working on Dungeons and Dragons, what do you take from those days? What do you hold on to?
I've been fortunate that I stayed in the industry long enough that I got over the problems that I had when I left the first time, in '94 with the Devil. The things that I value about the industry are the things that I valued about the time at TSR. I was incredibly fortunate to get to work with, Zeb and Jeff and Bob Salvatore and Ed Greenwood and Lane Cunningham and Mary and Eric and Bill. The time machine thing I would do if I went back would be to appreciate it more, because that collaborative atmosphere and the ability to go up into the games library and just play games with the designers we had there for fun. I was lucky to be part of it, and I'm incredibly fortunate that I've been able to make my career in this, because this is what I wanted to do. Yeah. I mean, if I get to do both worlds. I get to work on Pendragon, where the stuff I worked on my master's degree at one point on Gawain and the Green Knight actually makes a difference. So that's the biggest thing is just the collaborative, the community part of it, and the community of gamers as well, because the hobby, tabletop hobby, is so much bigger than just the people who put the games together. Right.
So. All right, well, Mary, your turn. Catch us up on whatever you want to say about the last 15, 20 years, however long since you and I worked together back in the day. And
well, we had a brief thing around 2010, I think, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I have I'm going to answer your question first, and then I'll tell you what I do.
Sure.
So what I really value about that time was the opportunity to work with a group of people with a shared vision. And it was the first, or maybe the second iteration with the team that Jim and I and Eric and Bill and that book team. It was a pattern in my career of working with a team that ended up doing more than it was told it should or thought it could. And that inspiring teams to think bigger than the niche they're put in is a recurring theme in my career. It's what inspires me. So wherever I have worked, it's what whatever my title or my capacity in that next phase, it's the recurring theme. And I totally had it with that team. If I had the same time, if Jim and I could get in the time machine together, I would have appreciated it more. I think we focused more on the adversity, and the adversity bonded us, and we were exhausted, and some of us had little kids at the same time too. So it seemed like an awful lot, and I don't know that we enjoyed it as much as you do in the rearview mirror. But it was a halcyon time, where we had a lot of authority, a lot of responsibility, and and as much authority as we were willing to take. Yep. And we took a lot.
Yeah.
We took a lot.
Yes, we did.
And I have discovered that most employers will allow you to take as much responsibility as you're willing to take, and not very many people are willing to take as much as they can. So it's kind of my motto.
Well, that was one thing with even the structure for TSR. They recognized that with Mary by moving us as a department out from under games formally. We became a parallel department to games in 90, I think it was. Right, and that was entirely from Mary's leadership and what the department transformed.
Yeah, the thing about taking more responsibility, I remember a quote from an attorney that I knew, and he'd asked once, how do I become partner? And the partner in the firm that he was asking says, well, you start acting like one.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah. And I just, in any job I've had, it's just, let's get shit done. Let's get it done. Let's do better. We can do better. Let's do better. So I've been lucky enough to have a couple of teams like that. I had a similar relationship when you brought me back to my team on the WotC side. Very, very great group of people. And that's a whole nother interview too, if anybody were interested in it. But I've been lucky enough to have that over and over again.
Well, and
in my current career, I have it at the nonprofit that I lead. So I've taken everything that I was lucky enough to learn in all of those iterations, including the Chicago Manual of Style, comes into play every day in my role running a small nonprofit for disabled kids. So how can you not love a job that requires all of your, and there you go, Jim's got it right there.
That's my TSR one.
There you go, yeah. How can you not love a job or a career that asks the best of you all the time? So, yeah. So I work for a company, an organization. Actually, we don't call them, when it's a nonprofit, you don't call them a company, you call them an agency. But I am the executive director of a nonprofit named Wonderland for here in Puget Sound that helps developmentally delayed and disabled kids. And when I started, we had about 15 employees, and we have 55 now. Wow. So we're doing a lot of good in the world, and that wakes me up every morning. And everything I learned at TSR and WotC prepared me for this role. So really, really grateful. Teams are important.
Yep.
Wow. Well, thank you. Oh, what a great hour. I wish we had another hour, but it's so good. Thank you so much for being on Fireside today. All right. Well, that unfortunately ends another episode of Fireside with Peter Adkison. Our guest next week will be Scap Elias. Yes, Scap has been on the show twice already. We're hoping this time he'll get it right. I know it's a horrible thing, but I have this rule: I can say anything I want to about Scap. And so can I. You missed your chance. But actually, Scap was heavily involved behind the scenes with Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition. So we will get to hear some news stories from him.
Nice.
In the meantime, there is plenty of cool stuff to check out on Gen Con TV. We have on Friday this week at 2 p.m. we have table takes. At 3:30 p.m. we have Gen Con online info, and at 5 p.m. Gen Con online info. Different topics: D20 Pro for the first one, Board Game Arena for the next. So we are on Gen Con TV. We're devoting a lot of resources right now to try and help you get ramped up to attend Gen Con online and figure out how to do it. Fortunately, we have this, event system in place already that you may have used before that we all used to do just on the internet. So, basically do that. Okay, and then next Monday at 6 p.m. we're gonna have the board games with the brothers Murph. Good, always good to see them. And then next Wednesday, 1:30, this game gets dicey. It's also a board gaming show. And then 4 o'clock. Back to me for Fireside with Peter Adkison. Please, if you miss any of our shows, you can find all of our streams about a day or so later on Gen Con Video YouTube channel, including all the episodes we filmed searching for untold stories behind Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons. Also, the episodes of Fireside are now available in podcast form. So please remember, follow, subscribe, turn on your notifications, and tell your friends. And so thanks again to our guests, Mary Kirchoff, James Lowder. Also our studio manager, which this week is Derek Guter, but I think Marcus was whispering in his ear along the way. Thanks for bearing with us for some of the technical challenges we had this episode. Also, Lauren Bond is our streaming manager, our producer, Derek Guter, and Gen Con TV for hosting us. And most of all, thank you for watching.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Peter.
Cheers, thank you.